At night, when the whole church had already been locked up, when the stained glass no longer cast halos of light and only long, patchy shadows stretched across empty pews, a slender girl still hadn't gone to sleep. Every night, exactly when the clock struck 3 slow chimes, she stepped into the hallway like a shadow that could breathe, leaving no sound, no trace. No one knew why she always passed through that spot every single night. Not the dining hall, not the Bible reading room, but toward an old wooden box at the end of the corridor. Were these strange habits, the way her eyes dodged, her careful footsteps, her arms wrapped around something as if it held her last breath, signs of a brewing rebellion, or did they carry a story no one had dared to ask? Stay with us today, because Amani's story isn't just about a child, it's about a silence that went on for too long, and the first crack loud enough to break it. In the last row of a small tin-roofed church where the afternoon wind often howled through brick gaps like a sigh for those who had nothing left to say, there was a quiet black girl who always sat alone. 15, tall and thin, rounded shoulders, eyes calm but never dull, like rainwater settled on old glass. Her name was Amani. People often forgot her name, but they remembered the shadow she cast across the floor every time the altar lights dimmed. Amani wasn't close to anyone in her foster home. She didn't avoid people, but she didn't seek them out either. She didn't wear earbuds like most kids her age. She didn't scroll under the table during Bible study. She simply sat, like everything around her could keep moving without her, and yet she noticed all of it, with the quiet attention of someone who'd long grown used to watching from the edges. Her foster mother once said she was so quiet it's almost scary. The foster father added, "She's well behaved, but there's something about her just too still." Only Pastor William, the man who brought her home from the orphanage after a prayer retreat last year, seemed to understand that her silence wasn't empty. It was full, full of things she hadn't yet found words for. Amani had 3 strange habits that only revealed themselves to those who lived with her long enough. First, she never went to bed before the clock struck 3, no matter how tired, how cold, how dark the room already was. Second, she always woke before the kitchen staff, quietly washing dishes no one asked her to. And third, the one that unsettled her foster mother the most. Every night, she asked to sit by the window, where the moonlight poured in the strongest, and stayed there until her eyelids finally gave in to the night wind. No one quite understood how a child raised in an orphanage wasn't afraid of the dark. Maybe because to her, light wasn't always warm, and darkness, when you knew how to hold it, could sometimes be a shelter. Amani rarely spoke about the past, but every now and then, at dinner, if someone happened to mention the old train station, she would pause, blink once, like she'd just heard the faint sound of a train whistle from a place further away than memory could reach. Once her foster mother asked, "Do you have anything you'd like to pray for?" Amani nodded slowly. "Yes, Anna, but I think God's too busy listening to someone else." Then she looked down and carefully folded her napkin into a perfect square, as if that was the most complete answer she could offer. No one knew that every night, after the doors had been quietly locked and the footsteps of the congregation had withdrawn into their private darkness, that girl would rise again, not to seek anyone, not to run, but to return to a place only she knew. That night, Pastor William left his office later than usual. He had been about to head upstairs when a faint glow from the north hallway caught his eye. There, through a pane of fog glass, he saw a figure moving. Not the kind of stride that belonged to someone walking freely, but the careful, hushed steps of someone passing through a place they weren't supposed to be, yet had known too long to still feel afraid. It was Amani. She didn't know someone was watching her. The pastor didn't call out, didn't confront her. He simply kept his distance. His shadow blended into the dim corridor, each step growing heavier, not from age but from something that had stirred a long dormant instinct inside him. Amani stopped at the end of the hallway, where the brick wall had faded with time, and a single old oil lamp still hung, untouched, not yet replaced by the electric lighting used elsewhere in the church. She bent forward, doing something with both hands. She wasn't forcing a lock. She wasn't taking anything. And then, a sudden noise. A side storage door slammed open from the wind. Just that, but enough to startle her. She spun around, saw no one. The light flickered, as if it too was shaken by the quickened beat of her heart. Clutching something tightly to her chest, Amani bolted toward the stairs, disappearing around the corner. Pastor William didn't follow. He stood there for a long while. His face didn't hold anger, nor understanding, just something like regret, slowly pressing into the lines along his jaw as he turned back toward his office. A thousand silent questions unspooling in his mind. He didn't speak of what he saw that night, but the next morning he didn't open his Bible, didn't sit at his desk like he normally did. He simply washed his hands longer before service and paused for several quiet minutes in the north hallway, where the light always seemed a little dimmer, as if it too was keeping a secret. By noon, he was in the administrative office, requesting a copy of the security footage from that corridor. The security guard, a middle-aged man who never really paid attention to the kids, looked up, puzzled. "Something missing, Pastor." William didn't answer right away. He simply looked up, eyes deep, not angry, but with a kind of worry surfacing just beneath a practiced calm. "Nothing's missing," he finally said. "But maybe we're about to lose something much bigger." The video footage was copied to a USB drive and sent to Pastor William and a few members of the church board. A ripple of whispers began to spread like a hidden fire beneath dry leaves. No one knew exactly what had happened, only vague murmurs. A kid did something they weren't supposed to, right here in the church. Less than 4 hours later, an emergency meeting was called. Not to ask questions, but to take action. One video clip, no audio, no explanation from the child shown on screen. But it was the silence of the footage that became the heaviest evidence of all. Because people, when they don't understand, tend to fill in the blanks with assumptions. And when those assumptions come from fear or prejudice, they don't need truth to justify their actions. Amani was called into the center of the packed room. She didn't know how many hands that video had passed through. She only knew that for the first time, every gaze no longer saw her as a child, but as a possible threat, something that might grow into a force they could no longer control. The surveillance footage played. When the screen lit up, not a single person stirred. The chairs, once set shoulder to shoulder, now seemed to shrink away, leaving only the projector's glow casting a thin silhouette onto the white wall. Familiar and yet distant. It was Amani. Not the Amani who sat still in Bible study, or the Amani who washed dishes early each morning, but the Amani of midnight, a figure that moved after curfew, after the church bells, after grown-ups had withdrawn into their own quiet. She appeared in the north hallway, where the yellow lights often flickered, where few ever walked except the cleaning staff or those who wished not to be seen. She approached a corner where a small, old, dark wooden box sat, its latch loose but intact, bearing faded letters that once read, "Prayer Box." That box, once considered the holiest space after the Bible itself, where every congregant had once slipped in a desperate whisper, where a mother prayed for her child's healing, a man on the verge of losing his home begged for a miracle, where an old woman wrote that she felt invisible among the communion tables. And yet, it was also a place no one had mentioned in years, a place people assumed God no longer read from. Amani placed both hands on the lid, as if to wake a spirit long asleep. Then she lifted it, slowly, almost reverently. The hallway light cast at an angle across her face, revealing eyes that didn't dart. She didn't look around. She didn't breathe hard. There was not a single sign that she believed what she was doing was wrong. Her hand reached inside the box and pulled out a piece of paper. Folded into thirds as slightly wrinkled, the handwriting blurred together as if it had been written in tears. She read, not quickly. Her eyes followed each line like someone feeling their way through the dark. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out a small, weathered notebook and began to copy. She didn't copy mechanically. She wrote the way only someone who has once held something too precious to lose could understand. With each word she paused, as if listening first, then writing. Every now and then, she tilted her head, not to check, but almost as if waiting to hear an echo from the prayer itself before choosing to carry it forward. The angle of her face appeared clearly on screen. No frown, no confusion. Only a kind of gaze you would never see in a thief. It was the gaze of someone safeguarding another person's pain because she couldn't bear to let it be forgotten. No one could hear any sound in the video, but everyone in the room felt something breathing, something warm and sharp slipping deep into their bones. Near the end of the footage, Amani placed the paper gently back in its spot, smoothing its edges like an apology for waking it. Then she closed the lid, bowed her head, and disappeared from the frame, taking with her that notebook and something no one had words for. And yet, when the screen finally went dark, the first thing that broke the silence was a faint scoff, then a woman's voice cold as brine salt. Told you, orphan kids never know where the line is. Who does she think she is? One of the chosen? The foster father glanced at his wife, then gave a small nod. Not in defense, not in protest. Someone in the room said, in a voice sharp enough to slice fabric, "This isn't some childish mistake. This is what it looks like when someone steals trust." Amani was called to stand in the center of the room. No hands touched her, yet the air around her pulled tight, like an invisible cord closing in. She stood tall, her hair neatly tied, her uniform pressed, hands folded in front of her. Not in defense, not in surrender. Pastor William looked at her. He hoped she would cry, or at least lower her head, something to give him permission to say, "She knows what she did," but she didn't cry. She didn't lower her head. She simply looked straight ahead, looked at every person in the room, as if asking, "Have any of you ever read those words?" And in that moment, without any formal ruling from the pastor or the council, the room passed judgment the way it always had, by stamping a sentence on her forehead without trial. The girl who stole trust. The meeting dragged on for over an hour, but time inside that room didn't move with the ticking of the clock. It stalled, pressing down on the air like a pane of thick glass, warped but reflecting every glance cast at Amani like a stain spreading across a white page of scripture. No one said she stole money. No one accused her of damage. And yet somehow a 15-year-old child had been placed at the center of a circle of adults, as if she had just upended the very order they had worked so hard to preserve. A woman from the parents' committee stood up first. Her voice was steady, not insulting, but as cold as the concrete wall behind the altar. If she sees no problem with violating the most sacred space in this church, then she doesn't belong in this community. Another person followed. We can't allow this kind of behavior to be chalked up to teenage curiosity. That's exactly how wrongness starts, from leniency. There were a few nods. Some eyes dropped down to notepads, pretending to take notes, but no one stood to speak on Amani's behalf. Not one. On the right side of the room, Amani's foster parents sat close together. The wife had her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. The husband leaned forward, elbows on knees, not once looking at her. It wasn't until someone asked directly, "What do the two of you think? Do you still want to keep the girl in your home?" The man cleared his throat. His eyes never once met the child standing before him. If she acknowledges what she did, apologizes to the congregation, then we think she can still be guided. If not, then maybe it's just not a good fit. Amani said nothing. She stood tall, both hands gripping each other, her eyes no longer searching for a nod from anyone, only trying to count the rhythm of her own heartbeat so she wouldn't fall apart. At that moment, Pastor William drew a deep breath. He glanced down at the worn silver ring on his finger, the one he had worn since the first day of his ordination. Then he looked up, about to speak. His throat moved. His hand began to rise, a familiar gesture he used before asking to speak. But right then, the head of the ritual council, Mr. Garrison, cut in. "With all due respect, Pastor, this isn't a matter of faith. This is about community order." That sentence, not loud, not harsh, landed like a steel pin, pushing him back into his seat. His hand dropped to his thigh. His eyes settled on Amani. His gaze was no longer steady, and under the soft glow of the ceiling lights, Amani saw it clearly. The man who had once taken her from the orphanage now couldn't even take one step toward her, a hairline fracture. No one heard it. But if you've ever hoped someone would stand up for you, and they didn't, you'd know that kind of fracture doesn't live on the surface. As the meeting sank into a lull of silence and weariness, as everything seemed to have quietly settled, that the child was wrong for being out of line, that her actions were dangerous simply for being ill-timed, a soft tap of a cane struck the floor, an off note in the choir of quiet compromise. From the back row, an elderly black woman slowly stood up. Her back was slightly bent, a fraying wool shawl draped over her shoulders, her face lined deep with time, but her eyes still clear and deep like an old well. "My name is Mabel Thomas. I'm not part of the council, not on the parents' board, but I've lived long enough to recognize a soul fighting not to be forgotten," she said. 30 years ago, I lost my son. He died on his way home from juvenile detention. No one let me speak. So I wrote. I wrote what I couldn't say aloud and slipped it into the wooden box at the end of the hall. The box you all still call the prayer box. Mabel reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and worn at the edges. One corner was torn, the handwriting shaky but pressed hard into the page. The first line was still legible. "If someone finds this, please remember my name is Mabel, a mother who lost her son and wasn't allowed to grieve." I never expected God to read it. I just wanted someone to know I existed. And today, when I saw that girl writing every word down, I knew she had done what no one else in this room has dared to do for years. She listened. A silence settled over the room like ash after an explosion no one realized had gone off. But then from the front row, Garrison spoke, his voice even, like he was reading minutes from a meeting. "We thank you, Ms. Mabel, but today isn't about emotion. This is about a systemic violation." Another voice added, "We can't judge behavior by personal experience. Kindness isn't a substitute for order." Mabel didn't respond. She simply nodded, her hand trembling slightly, then slowly turned back toward her seat. But as she passed Amani, she stopped. She didn't touch her, didn't whisper. She just looked into the girl's eyes, the same eyes that hadn't shed a single tear all afternoon, and gave a small nod as if to say, "You're not wrong. You never were." At the far end of the room, a woman in a long brown coat had been sitting silently since the meeting began. No one asked who she was, and no one seemed to notice when she arrived. Some assumed she was a city official, others thought she might be legal counsel for the county. Only Pastor William, who had glanced her way twice, seemed to know better. Jasmine Crockett, a woman of fierce faith, she often came to this church to pray, and today by chance she had witnessed this. Crockett didn't speak. She knew that in rooms like this, truth doesn't die from being denied. It dies from being deemed inconvenient. She watched, her gaze unblinking, spine straight as a ruler, hands folded at her waist like someone ready to testify. And then she saw it, a single offbeat detail in a room full of harmony. The cleaning woman, leaning against the side door, her hand gripping a broom with a worn handle, her eyes not on anyone in the room. Her gaze was fixed on the box. The prayer box now treated as the evidence of a crime no one could quite define. Her fingers trembled, not from cold, but from something warming slowly in the palm of her hand. The truth. Crockett didn't approach, didn't call her name, but she knew. The wall had cracked, just a little, and all it would take was one right touch. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, for the truth to come rushing in like wind through a window that had been sealed for far too long. And then Garrison spoke for the last time. He stood tall, his dark brown robe just long enough to evoke the grandeur of formal service. But the words that came from his mouth carried something that should never exist inside any house of worship. "We're making a mess over a child, a black child, an orphan, one with no clear background. No one knows where she even picked up this little act of righteousness." He looked around the room, then lowered his voice, which only made the next sentence pierce deeper, like a needle to the chest. "Who really believes a girl like that rewrote those letters for pure reasons? Don't kid yourselves." The room went still, not out of agreement, but because everyone knew, once Garrison had gone that far, no one else would dare stand up. And then someone did. A slow, deliberate motion, like the sound of a bolt clicking open from the inside. Jasmine Crockett, dark brown coat, no papers in hand but a single slim folder. She didn't raise her voice, didn't gesture, but as she stepped out from the back row, heads began to turn. "May I speak?" Her voice rang clear, sharp as a razor slicing the air. "My name is Jasmine Crockett. Allow me to get straight to the point. I want you all to take a look at several letters, taken directly from the notebook of the very girl you're treating like a thief." She stepped forward. The ceiling light fell on her face. Not angry, not pleading, just unmistakably precise. "Among those," she said, raising one sheet, "is this letter. Never published, never seen by the pastor, but it's been sitting in that box, the one you call sacred, for nearly 2 decades." Garrison frowned. "We can't confirm—" "You might want to hear it first," Crockett interrupted. Her tone didn't rise, but no one else said a word. "I am a mother. I came here asking for a place for my unborn child. Instead, they pressured me to get an abortion. They said the church couldn't allow an unmarried black girl to give birth in the parish. I don't blame God, but I fear that my child will grow up in a world where every safe place has locks on the inside." She lowered the paper. "Written in 2004. No signature, but the handwriting matches exactly with a woman who left the congregation shortly after." She turned to Garrison. "And the person reported to have personally advised that girl was you." Garrison stepped back. "This is fabricated." A voice rose from the side door, shaky but clear enough. "No, it's true." Every head in the room turned. The cleaning woman stood there. She still held the broom, but her back was straight now, her lips pressed tight, like someone who had just snapped an old joint back into place. "I was assigned to read and sort the letters every week, but I was never allowed to open all of them. Mr. Garrison told me to set aside the ones that were too negative, not helpful to the community. I saw letters asking for help with domestic violence, with hunger, with job loss, but he said, 'Don't let poor folks turn this place into a flyer board.'" No one said anything. Only Mabel in the back of the room brought her hands together at her chest, not crying, just closing her eyes like someone witnessing a promise finally kept. Crockett stepped forward. "What Amani copied wasn't theft. It was the last drops of people no one wanted to hear, and she listened, in place of every adult in this room who didn't." She looked across the room, her gaze unwavering. "The truth is, that prayer box wasn't violated by a child. It was manipulated, controlled, and distorted from the inside, to erase the voices of the poor, the black, the ones who didn't dress the part or speak the part." A chair scraped back. Garrison wavered, and Amani, the 15-year-old girl, was still standing at the center of the room, not crying, not smiling, just looking at Mrs. Crockett the way someone might look at a place they'd never truly believed could exist. Justice, with a warm hand and real breath. Garrison didn't speak again. He looked around the room, as if still hoping for one raised hand, one nod, one quiet signal of loyalty, anything to save the last thread of his pride. But every face in the room, even those that once quietly agreed, had now turned away. No one stood. No one stopped him. His steps faltered, like someone unsure whether the ground beneath them would still hold. The dark robe that once made him look dignified now only made him look heavy, unnecessary, out of place. No one forced him out, but no one held him back. And that silence was the cruelest verdict of all. He left the meeting room like a shadow that no longer belonged to its time. The wooden door closed behind him, not loudly, but with a sound like the final nail into the coffin of a man who once believed he stood above every whispered prayer. Jasmine Crockett didn't look back. She remained still, her eyes sweeping across the room that had nearly condemned a child, only because the grown-ups inside it had never learned how to bow. Then she spoke. "Prayer is meant to be heard, but all of you've been covering your ears for far too long." One sentence, but it flipped the entire room inside out, exposing a truth everyone had always known but never dared to say aloud. For all those years, the prayer box hadn't been violated by a child, but by the very hands dressed in robes, speaking words of virtue while living as shadows of the status they feared to lose. In the back row, the cleaning woman lowered her head, not in shame, but as if finally allowed to breathe. Amani stood still. Her eyes met Crockett's. No words were exchanged. None were needed, because in that moment everyone understood. The one they thought unworthy of being heard was the very person who had just restored the meaning of listening. Amani was not expelled. The meeting ended without a vote, because everyone knew what needed removing had never been the girl. The prayer box, long sealed shut, would now be opened weekly. No longer a tomb for silent suffering, but a place where people could see each other clearly, in the truest voices they had. On the church steps, after nearly everyone had gone, Crockett placed a new notebook into Amani's hands. Chestnut leather cover, carefully stitched binding, no decoration, no title. Just a single handwritten line on the first page. Keep writing. Because every child deserves to hold on to their faith. Amani clutched the notebook to her chest. She said nothing, but her eyes, and for the first time, were no longer a place to hide. They were a place to begin. Sometimes, justice doesn't need a gavel. It only needs one person willing to listen, truly listen, to another. The prayer box wasn't violated by a child who chose to remember. It was violated by grown-ups who chose to forget what they once begged for. And children like Amani, if allowed to stay, may be the last ones left to protect what's human in a world too used to erasing it.